Hello, welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. Today I'm going to talk about a meme that I've just seen on the Tinternet, and I thought I would talk about it. I actually disagree with this meme, but it all depends on how you define the term atheist. So here we have a number of babies newborn babies, and each one of these babies is labelled atheist because the idea is that these... I don't know exactly what you'd say. They either don't believe in a God or have no belief in a God. They lack a belief in God. And this is where we get onto arguments about whether the term atheist, as is generally used, is defined by either strong or weak atheism, positive or negative atheism, explicit or implicit atheism. I am someone who has always advocated that if you are going to say explicitly, I do not believe that God exists, or I believe no God exists, I believe there is no God. And that's, I think, the more correct phrasing. I believe that there is no God. Then you are a strong atheist. And actually, most atheists, online or wherever, will probably better be described as strong atheists, and we'll talk about the terminology in a second, by point of fact that they will be arguing vociferously online that God does not exist. But often they will say, I have a lack of belief in God. And I think that is often a way to allow them to get out of having a belief. Because if you have a belief, then it's more like religion, and atheists don't like to say that they have beliefs. So they have a lack of belief, but I think that's incorrect. I think they believe when they are certainly the stronger end of the spectrum, particularly the sorts that are arguing online. They are arguing that they believe God does not exist, which is different to just lacking a belief in God. Now, you could say that all of these babies lack a belief in God, and therefore they're atheists, but they lack a belief in anything. In fact, they lack beliefs in the same way a rock lacks beliefs. So you wouldn't call a rock or a sheep or a banana an atheist, right? So does it make sense to call a baby an atheist? And I would say no, it doesn't, because I would adhere to the strong definition of atheism. So let's just go to the Wikipedia page to give us a little bit of help here. And there's a little diagram that you can see where you have strong atheism at the bottom. I know my picture is slightly in covering that up. You've got weak atheism and strong atheism. And strong atheism exists within explicit atheism is what this picture dictates. Well, what all those terms mean? Well, negative atheism, or weak or soft atheism, is where a person does not believe in the existence of deities, but does not necessarily explicitly assert that there are none. Whereas positive atheism, or strong or hard atheism, asserts that no deities exist. And I think that is what most people who are arguing online really are. They're actually strong atheists, but they will try and claim that a kind of form of weak atheism for one reason or another. But I just think that that's incorrect. And there is some discussion over this. So if we come down to this article, this wiki entry, positive and negative atheism are frequently used by philosopher George H. Smith as synonyms for the less well-known categories of implicit and explicit atheism, also relating to whether an individual holds a specific view that God does not exist. Positive atheists explicitly assert that it is false that any deities exist. So you can either say it is false that God exists, or I believe that God does not exist. It's either a negation of a positive proposition or just a negative proposition, if you like. So negative atheists assert that they do not believe any deities exist, but do not necessarily explicitly assert it is true that no deity exists. So the question then would be, well, is that what a baby is doing? I mean, a baby is making no assertions or having no beliefs. So even a weak atheist or a negative atheist might not entail including children. Those who do not believe any deities exist but do not assert such non-belief are included among implicit atheists. Among implicit atheists are thus included the following. So this is where children might, as according to the definition of implicit atheism, will find themselves. So children and adults who have never heard of deities, people who have never heard of deities but have never given the idea any, who have heard of deities but never given the idea any considerable thought, and those agnostics who suspend belief about deities but do not reject such a belief. All implicit atheists are included in the negative and weak categorization. So you've got implicit atheism as maybe this whole umbrella term that includes kind of agnostics but also children. But then you would include rocks and sheep, babies, and I just think it becomes slightly problematic. And I don't think that's functionally how we use the term atheist. Like if I am to say that guy's an atheist, what I'm really implying is that guy has very clearly said that he doesn't believe that God exists. I wouldn't look at a child and say that kid's an atheist. I just don't realistically think we do that. So I think there's maybe equivocation going on here in the use of the term atheist, and I think that's maybe a fun little meme, but I genuinely don't think it is an accurate meme. But again, it depends how you define atheist, and that's because I define atheism as strong atheism, and I think that's functionally how it is used. I'll continue the article, just finish the end here. Under the negative atheism classification, agnostics are atheists. The validity of this categorization is disputed, however, and a few prominent atheists, such as Richard Dawkins, avoid it. In the God Delusion, Dawkins describes people for whom the probability of the existence of God is between very high and very low as agnostic, and reserves the term strong atheist for those who claim to know there is no belief. There is no God. Of course, then, we're talking about what knowing is. Where is your demarcation between knowing something and not knowing something, or how does belief fit in? So, like, I usually, if I'm being technical, call myself an agnostic atheist because I can't know indubitably that God does not exist. I can only reserve that kind of level of indubitable belief for cogito ergo sum, a kind of René Descartes approach to epistemology, where the only thing we can know 100% is that we, as thinking entities, whatever the we is, whatever the I is, whatever the thinking entity exists. Like, this exists in order to doubt that it exists. Like, if I'm going, well, do I really exist, or am I a brain in a vat? Well, in order to be doubting my existence, there has to be some kind of experience that's going on there in order to have these thoughts, right? So the thinking entity exists in order to doubt, but we can play around with all of those terms, really. But yeah, so I think we're all agnostic about everything to some degree. It's about your level of probability, but at what point do you go, from 0 to 100%? Well, I know the idea that God does not exist can't be 100% because that can only be reserved for cogito ergo sum. So therefore, for me, I don't know. It's probably like 96%. I don't know, something like that. I'm really pretty sure God doesn't exist, as defined. But again, it depends how you define God. Can you have some kind of panentheist understanding of God being like everything, or the laws of nature, or whatever? And okay, there's slightly more probability that exists as so defined, but so it will depend how you define God. But like, do I know that God doesn't exist? Well, where does the demarcation for know and not know come? Like, I know that climate change is happening, but actually, there is a percentage chance it's not happening, and actually the data is, but I will say that I know it's happening. So where does no start? Is it 70% onwards? Is it 60% probability? Is it 80, 90, 95? So this is all quite, well, as you know, if you've followed me at all over the years, it's all about trying to demarcate continua, right? So you have a continuum and you're like, this is it's a problem of species, it's a Socrates paradox or whatever. dogs don't give birth to non-dogs. So when you move from one species to another, it is a kind of a construct of the human mind, and we draw an arbitrary line in the continuum to say this is now a new species, but it's not really. It's kind of murky and it's around this whole area. That's kind of what we're talking about here. Problems of demarcation are so legion. Okay, so just to go back, Dawkins describes people for whom the probability of the existence of God is between very high and very low as agnostic, and reserves the term strong atheist for those who claim to know there is no God. Where is very high and no? Where do you go from very high to no? I would say no is in the very high category. Anyway, he categorizes himself as a de facto atheist, but not a strong atheist on this scale. Within negative atheism, so in other words, he's like, I'm effectively an atheist because I go about my life believing that no God exists, but I wouldn't punt to it being, I think he does it on a scale of 1 to 7, doesn't he? He wouldn't put himself as a 7. Yeah, so you can play around with kind of no belief and strong atheist and very high probability and all of these ideas. Within negative atheism, and philosopher Anthony Kenny further distinguishes between agnostics who find the claim God exists uncertain and theological non-cognitivists who consider all talk of gods to be meaningless. And you get onto, in fact, there's an entry here, agnosticism, which is the idea that as it says here, that the question of the existence of God is meaningless because the word God has no coherent or unambiguous definition. Now, I kind of hinted at that earlier, what is the definition of God, and how does that then factor into my definition of atheism? So if you can define God as this kind of mother nature type thing, well, actually that's going to really change my my assessment as to whether I'm an atheist or not. But just in the general sense of God as these personified entities, going around and creating stuff and interacting with reality, then I would be a strong atheist, and I imagine most people who describe themselves as atheists really are strong atheists, and those people would actually, if they thought long and hard about it, find that this meme is problematic, and that these babies aren't actually atheists. They're not agnostics. They are lacking in belief. But you might say, well, that is the definition of atheism, lacking in belief in God, but they have no beliefs. And that's why I find the lacking in belief of a God, because, as I say, if someone's arguing 10 hours a day online that God doesn't exist, I don't think they lack a belief that God exists. I think they believe firmly that God doesn't exist, and those are two different things. So I think it is a problem to define a baby as an atheist. Let me know what you think. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.